What is freedom? My gut is telling me that instead of answers, I might just end up finding more questions, but let's give it a shot. Most of the time, we cannot see freedom with our eyes, hear it with our ears, smell it with our noses, feel it with our hands, or taste it with our tongues. And yet, in the United States, it is held up as the best and greatest way for human beings to live. It is obvious that only a crazy and irrational person would ever suggest that a return to the days of the slave trade before the Civil War is an ideal situation. But everyone seems to have their own idea of what freedom is in America, and there are times when I don't know if that's really a good thing or a bad thing. Maybe I shouldn't be so surprised, since I already know that in a country such as ours, beliefs about anything and everything are as diverse and variable as people are themselves diverse. But surely there has to be some kind of method to the madness. Both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution make their attempts to define that method, put it on paper, and make it the law of the land. But for something as wonderful as freedom is, it also seems chock full of contradictions and paradoxes. For example, we call the United States the land of the free, and at the same time, we have one of the largest prison populations in the world, if not the largest. In this case, the land of the free simply translates as not occupied by a foreign government, such as that of the English monarchy. Perhaps one of the easiest ways to begin to understand freedom and its byproducts is to start by thinking about rules and regulations. So I want everyone watching this video to think back to their childhoods for a moment. When you're a kid, freedom simply means time off from school, or maybe it means not having to live under the iron fist of your parents' rules once you grow up. Of course, if your parents disagree on whether their rules should be administered with the iron fist or the velvet glove, all bets are off. Also, it's fair to assume that when you were in school, there were rules for how to behave in class, and when you broke one or more of them, there were consequences, such as a verbal warning from your teachers, or after-school detention, or having your parents called on the phone. And when you played games at recess or in your physical education class, there were also rules for playing the game, and if you refused to play by the rules, you weren't allowed to participate. Cheating was also frowned upon, whether it took place on the playground or in the classroom. But of course, the consequence for following the rules and doing all of the right things in school was freedom. And when the school year ended for the summer, what were you and all of the other kids thinking about? Freedom, at least until next September. So that's usually the way kids understand freedom, but what happens once kids become adults and start getting into politics? That seems to be where things get much more complex. Politicians in the Republican Party want us to believe that they are the ones who stand for the freedoms, traditions, and family values that America holds dear, with the implication that Democrats don't, as do conservative pundits in the media. I could be wrong, but the society they actually envision seems to be one in which conservative Republican elites decide what is and isn't good for the American people. What's more, it has become clearer and clearer to me that in the last 20 years that the behavior of the religious right in declaring a culture war, in which such people as feminists, immigrants, liberals, homosexuals, intellectuals, journalists, actors, and musicians are the favorite targets, far from being an agenda about Christianity or freedom, might actually be a destabilizing politics of fear, exclusion, and scapegoating. It seems to me that if you call Republicans on the carpet for any of that, they'll usually respond by accusing Democrats and liberals of wanting the same thing. This might be true in some cases and not others, but as a liberal Facebook friend of mine recently put it, conservatives really do want a big, controlling government. They just want the big government to be under their control, and don't want to use it to actually help people. As for rules and regulations, these become fighting words to conservatives, Republicans, and right-leaning libertarians. It seems as though a lot of the same kids who might previously have been forced to follow the rules and regulations of the school playground are now the Republican politicians who pine for freedom and curse the regulations that interfere with their agendas. I have to be honest and say that I don't know an awful lot about economics, or Wall Street, or the business side of American life, so you'll forgive me if some of the arguments I'm making from this point forward get a little sloppy. Very often, conservatives hold up small businesses as the true source of job creation and economic stabilization in our country. In some situations, such as when Walmart sticks its fingers into every grocery store pie that it can, it's actually not hard to understand why they believe this. Then again, Rush Limbaugh once said that businesses, according to liberals, are the root of all evil. I don't think businesses are inherently evil, but it would appear that some of them do believe in engaging in risky or immoral behaviors if they can manipulate the consequences of such actions to their advantage. In an attempt to clarify this position, I will now paraphrase and modify a few thoughts from John Henry, author of LowGenius.net, whose posts I read quite often. Let's start from zero, he suggests. Imagine a United States with no people, no culture, no society, no corporations, and no laws. Pretty boring, right? Now let's bring in some people. As soon as they show up, you have to start creating some form of regulation, because some of them are broken, or bent, or insane, or just plain evil, and absent a prohibition against rape, murder, theft, or anything else that sane people might consider a universal crime, that is, an act considered morally, socially, and ethically wrong all over the world, they'll do it. And if you're going to have regulation, you'll also need some kind of system by which that regulation is created and enforced. That's right, conservatives, government. Even if it's nothing more than a Mayflower Compact type mutual agreement that says we're not going to kill each other today, we've just created a type of government. Now let's add corporations to our scenario. Corporations exist to make money. One day, a corporation, and let's use Freedom Industries in West Virginia as an example, builds a factory. Let's pretend that half the people die as a result of that factory polluting their drinking water. The remaining people say, well, we can't have this crap, and they make a new regulation. You're not allowed to poison the drinking water just because you can make money doing it. So now the CEO of Freedom Industries is in a bit of a panic, and we've got a little government going on, which means that there are people involved who have the power to make decisions about how the factory should best be prevented from poisoning people, such as the EPA. In response, Freedom Industries might say, well, your new law is going to cost me a lot of money. Here, Senator Anti-Big Government, why don't I just stick this pile of money into your campaign fund, and in exchange you can go back to Washington and write a law that makes my business illegal, but you have to grandfather me in. This way, I can operate in a non-competitive environment, and the lack of competition helps to mitigate the losses incurred as a result of this and other anti-pollution regulations. The crux of John's argument is that the problem isn't regulations in and of themselves. The problem is the fact that people are almost always finding ways to abuse the process of regulation. Therefore, the solution is not to eliminate regulation, but rather to eliminate corruption. This is one of the reasons why you hear someone like me shouting when the so-called fiscally responsible Republicans in Congress open their mouths about making cuts to programs like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. There is no doubt in my mind that those on the conservative side would like nothing better than to find some way, some simple way, to purge the corruption and abuse of these programs without affecting those such as myself who need them simply to survive. I hope I'm wrong, but my greatest fear happens to be that if Social Security cuts on a large scale ever become law, and they start affecting everyone else, eventually those cuts are going to come home to me someday. And I am still left wondering why some of my conservative friends continue to support the politicians and listen to the pundits who would advocate such cuts, in the name of law-abiding taxpayers having the freedom not to financially support those who don't need it. Why punish an entire group of people for the actions of the relative few who actually do take advantage of the system? And unfortunately, some of the byproducts of pure unadulterated freedom for such things as corporations often do turn out to be corruption, lack of ethics, and a greater concern for profit than for the long-term health and safety of the general public. John Henry says that is pretty much what businesses do by definition. They seek profit by any means possible, restricted only by regulations and ethics, with ethics proven to not always be effective. Indeed, ethical behavior can be a distinct competitive disadvantage in business. Because if everyone operates ethically, then it works. But human nature being what it is, everyone won't. Not even a substantial majority of everyone will, when there's money or power on the table. Thus, regulation. The purpose of government and regulations, folks, is to ensure that, whether everyone wants to act ethically or not, they either will act ethically or they won't act at all. Problems involving the complexity of some regulations which people on both sides of the aisle complain about, like the tax code, are beyond the scope of this video. How about freedom when it comes to safety and security? I admire Benjamin Franklin, but his oft-repeated, well-known expression that they that can give up essential liberty to obtain a little safety deserve neither liberty nor safety can seem like quite a paradox in the age of such things as a hyper-awareness of terrorism and the occasional mass shooting. Which is more important, liberty/freedom or safety? I would think that most average Americans will answer that both are equally important. If that is true, then what is liberty in America if it does not also bring with it a fair amount of safety for its citizens? Liberty and safety also bring with them the understanding that law and order must be maintained in a civil society. For example, if you are old enough and can pass tests to prove that you can be trusted with a driver's license, you therefore have the liberty to drive a car. But if you also decide to test that liberty by driving at 85 miles per hour in a 45 mile per hour zone, you are now in violation of the law, and the police can temporarily take away your liberty to drive in order to maintain the liberty and safety of other drivers on the road. The appropriate response in such a situation is and should be to simply pay your speeding ticket and make sure that you don't put yourself in that situation again, rather than to yell something like, "How dare the government take away my freedom to drive as fast as I please!" That's also the reason why such crimes as robbery, rape, and other forms of physical assault and murder are illegal all over the world, because there are no people living anywhere in the world who have so much freedom that they can usurp the freedom of others. No one is above the law. And it's only common sense that the safety and security of the American people should trump the liberty of terrorists to commit heinous acts on our soil. So a balance between freedom and safety certainly does need to be struck. Some terrorists, of course, tend to be deluded enough to call themselves freedom fighters. The good news is that the conservatives I know do believe in law and order, even if we don't always agree on how it should be implemented. And now we move on to freedom in the general American political arena. There really aren't enough words in my vocabulary to describe how, over the last 10 to 15 years, I truly grew to hate how the very word freedom itself came to be used and abused by President George W. Bush and his administration for everything they did after 9/11, especially when the Iraq War started going badly. Of course, one of Mr. Bush's core beliefs was that all people living in the world want to be able to live under the same kind of freedom that can be found here in the United States. While this idea may be fundamentally true, the idea that democracy or freedom can't be dispensed from the barrel of a gun seemed to be frequently lost on Bush and the other architects of the war. Unfortunately for Bush, I don't think he was ever really able to shed the cowboy image the rest of the world had of him. I believe that he and the GOP thought they owned the United States while he was in office, and the Republicans currently in Congress still think that they do. I think Bush second-guessed the Constitution almost all the time. The Patriot Act, Guantanamo Bay, enhanced interrogation, killing habeas corpus, warrantless wiretapping, signing statements, did whatever he felt like doing, Iraq, turning the Clinton-era budget surplus back into a budget deficit, warrantless wiretapping, signing statements, executive orders, and managed to get elected twice because he had plenty of friends in high places the first time, and because he had enough voters who were willing to tolerate the political consequences of his actions as long as they didn't backfire the second time, all in the name of his definition of freedom. After Bush finally left office and Barack Obama began his term, the conservative movement started to sing another new song about freedom. Nowhere did this seem more apparent than with the advent of the Tea Party and right-leaning libertarianism. A few years ago, former libertarian Edwin Linger wrote of these new movements in Salon magazine, saying, quote, "They are generally supportive of the gay community, completely behind marijuana legalization, and are often against ill-considered foreign wars. But a few good ideas don't make up for some spectacularly bad ones. Their saving grace is a complete lack of organizational ability, which is why they are always trying to take over the Republican Party rather than create a party of their own." He ends his piece by saying, quote, "Libertarians think they own the word freedom, but it's a word that often obfuscates more than enlightens. If you believe the Johann Wolfgang von Goethe quote that none are more hopelessly enslaved than those who falsely believe they are free, then libertarians live in a prison of their own ideology. And in their own ways, so do many conservatives and Republicans, I think." Edwin Linger is now a liberal Democrat. To hear some of the more hard-right conservatives talk, one might think that what they truly want for America is no longer the old standby principle of limited government, but anarchy. Freedom, without any kind of government whatsoever. Indeed, I have one conservative friend who has said on a fairly regular basis that all she really wants is for the government to leave all of us ordinary people alone. I have others who say that if we could all learn to be self-sufficient, we wouldn't need to rely on government at all. Well, I understand the desire for self-sufficiency. As I was learning to cope with my disability condition as a boy, I was brought up to believe in myself, to value my independence, to celebrate the things that I can do unhindered by my legs that don't work just right, to work on getting better at things that I can't do as well physically as other people, and to expect to be treated in the same way as everybody else. You might think that I would be able to get behind conservative freedom, limited government principles for that reason alone. But I can't do it, because nothing about how I grew up means that I don't still need to ask for help from others every now and then. And I do still have physical obstacles, some of which I've only just begun to come to terms with in the last few years. So that in a nutshell is why it might seem to conservatives that I'm defending big government. But what I'm really calling for is a government that allows for everyone else to be as lucky as I have been, and makes the needs of its people as high a priority as it makes, say, defense spending. So by some conservatives' definition of freedom, I am not free, physically, without some relatively small amount of government assistance. Therefore, the only conclusion I can draw that makes sense is that one person's nanny state is another person's lifelines. My definition of freedom is more in line with that of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. We have come to a clear realization of the fact that true individual freedom cannot exist without economic security and independence, he said in 1944. Necessitous men are not free men. If people don't have or can't get everything they need to live in this world, including food, clothing, water, shelter, education, and, yes, health care, then they are not free. It sounds like very simple logic to me. I suppose these are all the answers I can find about freedom for now, and as anticipated, all I really have left are questions. Although it may appear that I spent several minutes in this video painting an unflattering picture of the way that corporations work, I concede that they do have legitimate interests and purposes in doing what they can to avoid regulations that would stop them from being profitable. But when you have corporations lining the pockets of a political party, which many liberals believe encourages authoritarianism, political suppression of minorities and the poor, i.e. voter ID issues in some states, military imperialism, i.e. Iraq, and careless profiteering and speculation, which leads to jobs being lost and/or shipped overseas, can you really have freedom? Whom should the people of West Virginia have been angry with? Should they have been angry with President Obama because he was a Democrat, or with the company that contaminated their drinking water because its CEO shunned the EPA regulations that might have been able to change something about the situation if they were in place? If you're a conservative, what happens when the principles that you believe in get in your own way? Does having the freedom to do what we want without fear of being punished really include the freedom to be uneducated? Is having freedom really about having freedom, if that's what we want? Does having the freedom to say what we want also include the freedom to lie? Is there anything that conservatives, Republicans, and right-leaning libertarians actually want the government to have the freedom to do? Well, I think it's safe to assume that they want street cleaning, they want garbage collection, they want the post office to function adequately. They see at least some value in public education, some people more than others. They want to help to make sure that our food and water supplies are protected. They want the protections offered by police and fire departments when necessary. They want the military to step up and defend America when necessary. They want a budget surplus, but they don't want taxes. And they don't want Democrats to hold the majority in Congress or a Democrat in the White House. They believe government is part of the problem, and sometimes they don't see where it can be part of the solution. Or, as William Rivers Pitt has written, maybe, just maybe, government isn't the problem. Maybe the people we allow into government are the problem. Maybe the people who eviscerate regulations and then highlight ineffectual regulations as examples of bad governments are the problem with government. Maybe the people who are bought and paid for by private business have no business in public office. That's an easy fix if we want it." Unquote. Does freedom really have to be a partisan issue? I am left to think of the lesson that Peter Parker's Uncle Ben teaches him in the Spider-Man comic TV and movie franchises, that with great power comes great responsibility. Isn't it the same way with freedom? I wrote down these thoughts 4 years ago, and never really found answers to these questions that were good enough, until recently this past July, when David Brooks wrote a column for the New York Times entitled "Why Republicans Can't Govern," which I will read for you now. It can be found online at the Seattle Times, and was published on July 23, 2017, before the most recent version of an Obamacare repeal bill failed in Congress. There are many different flavors of freedom. For example, there is freedom as capacity and freedom as detachment. Freedom as capacity means supporting people so they have the ability to take advantage of life's opportunities. You encourage your friend to stick with piano practice so he will have the freedom to really play. You support your child during high school so she will have the liberty to pick her favorite college. Freedom as detachment is giving people space to do their own thing. It's based on the belief that people flourish best when they are unimpeded as much as possible. Freedom as detachment is marked by absence, the absence of coercion, interference, and obstacles. Back when the Republican Party functioned as a governing party, it embraced both styles of freedom, but gave legislative priority to freedom of capacity. Look at the Republicans' major legislative accomplishments of the past 30 years. They used government to give people more capacities. In 1990, George H.W. Bush signed the Americans with Disabilities Act, which gave disabled people more freedom to move about society. In 1996, Republicans passed and Bill Clinton signed a welfare reform law that tied benefits to work requirements so that recipients would develop the skills they need to succeed in the labor force. In 2003, Republicans passed a law giving Americans a new prescription drug benefit, which used market mechanisms to give them more control over how to use it. These legislative accomplishments were about using government in positive ways to widen people's options. They aimed at many of the same goals as Democrats, broader health coverage, lower poverty rates, but relied on less top-down mechanisms to get there. Over the past few decades, Republicans cast off the freedom as capacity tendency. They became exclusively the party of freedom as detachment. They became the get government off my back party, the leave us alone coalition, the drain the swamp party, the don't tread on me party. Philosophically, you can embrace or detest this shift, but one thing is indisputable. It has been a legislative disaster. The Republican Party has not been able to pass a single important piece of domestic legislation under this philosophic rubric. Despite all the screaming and campaigns, all the government shutdown fiascos, the GOP hasn't been able to eliminate a single important program or reform a single important entitlement or agency. Today, the GOP is flirting with its most humiliating failure, the failure to pass a health reform bill, even though the party controls all the levers of power. Worse, Republicans have managed to destroy any semblance of a normal legislative process along the way. There are many reasons Republicans have been failing as a governing party, but the primary one is intellectual. The freedom as detachment philosophy is a negative philosophy. It is about cutting back, not building. A party operating under this philosophy is not going to spawn creative thinkers who come up with positive new ideas for how to help people. It's not going to nurture policy entrepreneurs. It's not going to respect ideas, period. This is not a party that's going to produce a lot of modern-day versions of Jack Kemp. Second, Republican voters may respond to the freedom as detachment rhetoric during campaigns. It feels satisfying to say that everything would be fine if only those stuck-up elites in Washington got out of the way. But operationally, most Republicans support freedom as capacity legislation. If you're a regular American, the main threats to your freedom are illness, family breakdown, social decay, technological disruption, and globalization. If you're being buffeted by massive forces beyond your control, you don't want legislation that says, guess what? You're on your own. The Republicans could have come up with a health bill that helps people cope with illness and nurtures their capacities. A bill that offers catastrophic care to the millions of Americans left out of Obamacare, or health savings accounts to encourage preventive care. Republicans could have been honest with the American people and said, we're proposing a bill that preserves Obamacare and tries to make it sustainable. They could have touted some of the small reforms that are in fact buried in the Senate bill. But this is the drain the swamp party. The Republican centerpiece is, we're going to cut your Medicaid. So now we have a health care bill that everybody hates. It has a 17% approval rating. It has no sponsors, no hearings, no champions, and no advocates. As usual, Republican legislators have got themselves into a position where they have to vote for a bill they all despise. And if you think the GOP dysfunction is bad now, wait until we get to the debt ceiling wrangle, the budget fight, and the tax reform crack-up. Sure, Donald Trump is a boob, but that doesn't explain why Republicans can't govern from Capitol Hill. The answer is that we're living in a time when the prospects for the middle class are in sharp decline, and Republicans offer nothing but negativity, detachment, absence, and an axe.